Hello, thank you for joining us for our next in our Healthy Communities Conversation series. I'm Phil Goropoulos, President of CHI St. Joseph Children's Health. Today, I'm honored to have join me President Margee Ensign from Dickinson College. President Ensign joined the college just a few years ago, really, after a stint in Nigeria as the president of the American University there. Her career has spanned academics, administration, leadership has been kind of the stellar point the whole way through and a constant. So I'm really excited to have her join us and be able to add her voice to our conversations about what it takes to create and sustain healthy communities. Thank you for joining us, President Ensign.
Thank you, Phil. It's an honor to be with you, and welcome home to Dickinson.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be back and forth. We were talking to your team before that one of the strong points throughout my touchstones as I've made career decisions and personal decisions has always been Dickinson's campus and being able to come home here. So it's great to be here in the midst of a pandemic to figure out paths forward in a positive light.
Well, we're very proud of you.
Well, thank you. One of the things that we've done in this series, we've done live conversations prior to the pandemic. Now we're doing a series of recorded ones. And one of our guests that we had just last fall was Chef Jose Andres, who's since that point, he was big before, since then has become much larger in his advocacy work.
Right.
Is now over in Beirut, helping there after the explosion in their harbor.
Right.
One of the things that I asked him was to reflect upon his heritage as an immigrant coming to the United States and reflect upon that, his life in Spain prior to moving here, and since then being a world traveler and restaurateur,
Right.
and reflect upon what's something that he really thought the United States had that people don't realize is here, that he wished people knew existed here, either a cultural trait, something we take pride in.
Right.
And I thought your experience lended to a similar conversation, having worked in the African continent and come back now home to reflect on those similar questions. Like, what's something about the United States that you wish people in foreign countries were more aware of and would appreciate?
Well, there's a number of things we could talk about, but I think the thing that struck me when I moved to Nigeria and worked in Rwanda for many years is that Americans are really very generous, and it goes back to our early history. I'm sure you remember from your studies de Tocqueville's visit to the US in 1831, and he began documenting that we are a country of associations. And you know, the term nonprofit didn't exist then, of course, but probably from the beginning of our history, we have formed associations, organizations to help each other, which evolved into philanthropy. And it was surprising, both in my work in Central and South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, that that's still a pretty defining characteristic of America, that when people are in need, we reach out, we form these associations, we give back to places we've been. And so I think it's important to know that, and as you said, sometimes we know more about our country being away and looking back. And that was something that struck me when I took over as president of the American University of Nigeria. A traditional role in America is fundraising. But when I would go out and talk to wealthy Nigerians or Africans, they would ask, why are you asking? We're paying tuition. And so there was a real education effort to explain to people what philanthropy is and why it's important. And certainly during the challenges we faced in Northeast Nigeria that are continuing with refugees and with violence, that became an even more important part of my job, both the education and the fundraising. So I think that's a really defining characteristic of America.
Yeah, I think it's something people don't appreciate when you're here and you see it all the time. All of the different organizations that exist, even in towns like Carlisle, that help and try to lift up people in the community.
That's right.
The flip side of the question was also interesting to me when we were talking to Jose Andres, and you know, my father is an immigrant, so he brought with him his culture and his heritage in Greece, and then his perspective. And I always go back to him and I say, well, what's something that you had in Greece or that you experienced in Greece that you wish was more present in our own communities here? And there's so much, because we're more of a, I like to say we're more of a stew than a melting pot.
Yes, exactly.
And so we allow so much of that keeping of your culture that's so important to adding to our culture in the country, that maybe it's a harder question to ask, like what you would want to see from a culture that you interacted with that we don't have as strong a presence here.
I mean, there's many things there also, you know, the deep commitment to family, to generations lost. I think I would take that question a little differently. One of my big concerns is that Americans in general don't know enough about those cultures. I've written really extensively about the fact that our lack of education and knowledge and awareness of other countries and cultures and languages has been putting us at a disadvantage, and it's even more so now. So I would plea, as I do as a college president all the time, that we spend more time learning about those cultures and studying abroad and leaving America when we can again. You know, I'm proud to be a president of a college where the majority of students do leave and they come back transformed, as you know. So I think that's an important thing to consider and to talk about, is that we've really, especially at a moment in time when we're facing a global threat, we need to increase our knowledge about both global issues and other countries and cultures.
And I think an appreciation of it too.
Absolutely.
So it goes beyond that surface level, but
That's
to a
right.
deeper level of commitment and understanding.
Totally.
I did find your article interesting from, I think it was 2018, that in the liberal education,
Yes.
which that word comes so loaded, but didn't mean liberal in
Right,
political
right.
sense. In terms of identifying opportunities for kids to be able to engage with other cultures. And one piece that I thought interesting in that was the point that you were making, that so many people who go to study abroad, and even when you talk to just everyday citizens, not necessarily college students, about like, where would you like to go?
Right.
You know, the top of the list is always European countries.
Exactly.
When we really need to be learning more about all countries, and in particular the developing countries that are going to not just be our competitors, but be our allies and
Absolutely.
supports. So how do we go about changing that mindset so that there is seen as opportunity,
Right.
and creates that interest and passion for learning about those communities, emerging communities, China, as well as all of the African countries, where probably most Americans can't name more than one country in
Exactly,
Africa, which is a
exactly.
sad state.
I think it has to start early, and there has to be support for it, because it's expensive to leave the country, and it needs to be open to, you know, all citizens to leave. So we could start off by encouraging a second or a third language rather than restricting it. But language is the beginning, as you so wisely pointed out. A lot of it is about culture. So since I've been president here, we've begun a really intense intercultural competency and knowledge training program. So it's language, it's culture, and you know, if you start early enough with young kids, they're curious, they want to learn more, they want to go. So I'm hoping as we get through this hard time as Americans, we can sit back and reflect on what it means to be a member of a global community and how we learn more about it. So those are some of the things I would do. I was privileged, not from an immigrant family, but I'm from a family of airline pioneers. And that shaped me so much. The youngest of 5 children. By the time I came along, my parents were able to take me with them. And that's what generated this deep curiosity that's insatiable for other countries and cultures and travel and living abroad. So there's a variety of ways you can do it, but it's really important that we do it in an inclusive way, that it isn't just students who can afford it who can do it. You know, here at Dickinson, we put a great deal of our resources to make sure that any student who wants to can have that study abroad and living and learning experience.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as you look at you know, the COVID experience across the countries, but also even just locally, you know, within particularly like the Latino culture, you know, extended families are norms. And how much I think many of us now recognize, like how much we really need those
Absolutely.
family structures and extended family structures to be successful. And I'm very blessed because, you know, I happen to live right across the street from my mother, so she's
That's
stayed
wonderful.
very, very involved with my kids and
Right.
helping me so that I can both continue the career path
Right.
and helping the community through St. Joseph Children's Health, but know that my kids are cared for. When so many of my coworkers, of
Right.
people that I interact with in the community, that's the top question at the top of their mind. It's like, I don't know how to care for my kids
Right.
while I'm being called back to work,
Right.
but it's not safe for them either in the school environment or in the child care setting. And they're having to make really tough choices that are going to put them in economic peril
Exactly.
unnecessarily because of the way we structured society as a whole, and then how we've kind of gotten away from this idea of, you know, your extended family is an important part of who you
Absolutely.
are.
I think that's one of the things that many have learned from this experience. When you're isolated and not able to have physical contact with other people, I mean, that's a human need. That's a basic human need. And so I think you're right. I hear stories from students and others about family members who've been disconnected, reaching out. I was on a call this morning with an alum from Dickinson from a class in the 50s, and he said he was helping the classes from the 40s find each other. And I thought, that's a good thing. But you also point out something really important, and the college has been deeply involved in it, and that is we don't have a structured system of childcare. And most other developed countries do. So it's certainly something we're facing in this community. But I think both of those realizations, we need each other. We need each other physically. We need to be connected to our families and our communities. But we also need to make sure that young people, whose parents now generally are both working, are also taken care of.
And have the supports they need to be able to be successful, not just stored somewhere,
That's
which is how we kind of have viewed childcare. Unfortunately, is not seeing it as that holistic piece of continuing that child's social emotional development.
That's right, and hopefully this is, we're going to see some big changes from this period that we're living through.
I was pretty excited, and we're kind of completely off our list of questions we had discussed in advance. But one of the things that I was hopeful for, and we saw this also in our conversation we had with Mary Hadid around healthcare, was that in the political debates that we saw shaping, the upcoming presidential election, for the first time ever, you were hearing presidential candidates talk about things like access to education and affordability of education, it being a right as opposed to not even an opportunity.
That's right.
And then also actually going down into and recognizing that childcare is an essential ingredient to what we're creating as communities, and that I described it the other day to a reporter that paying for childcare is almost like an unfair tax upon parents, that now they have to pay for this in addition to trying to maintain their dreams, maintain their homes, and advance in a community. That I'm somewhat hopeful in a weirdly dark time that if we actually are willing to do the work to dream a little bit, we can end up with something so much more spectacular on the other side.
Right, I completely agree, and in some respects this goes back to your question about culture, because one of the things that has defined America for a long time is our individualism. Pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, that's all it's going to take. We know that's not true, but we idealize that, and other cultures and communities, as you well know, are much more communal in their approach, and the individual is a little less important in their needs and demands than the community. And as we see other cultures coming to America, I see that changing. So you're absolutely right. Perhaps we're at a moment when we realize if we really care about children, they are all in preschool. They're all getting the education that they need early. There's, countrywide childcare and access to health care. So you're right. Things that we weren't discussing even 3 or 4 years ago now seem to be at the top of the agenda. Now
I think
we
that's
just need to push for them.
Yeah, it's an exciting time.
Yep.
And then to be able to kind of really frame it as this is what defines America. It's not about giving up your dream of success and advancing more than your parents. It's about how do we do that together as opposed to just the one?
No, I hope that's the seismic shift that we're seeing now.
You can hope for it, right?
Yes.
So one of the things in your background that, there's so many fascinating things, because I described you when I was talking to Christy, my colleague, as we were driving here, that it really is like when you read the article, it was particularly in the Smithsonian Magazine about the rescue of the girls and bringing them back to the American University and helping them get their education and be safe. That your experience there reads like an Indiana Jones novel. That's how they depict it. Maybe that wasn't like how...
It was pretty crazy that morning.
So to me, what I found interesting was going beyond that. So yes, that piece, that's like a movie to me, reading it. But the idea that you took this campus, which is a traditional education based upon American universities, focused on education, and you made it so much more. It was about community. It was about extending resources, not just to the students there, but recognizing that you were part of this ecosystem, and the entire ecosystem had to evolve, not just your individual campus.
Right.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe the challenges in changing the mindset, because the original goal, what I understood about the university, was to basically replicate an American university.
Well, it was in a way, but let me just give you a little background. The man who founded it, who I had the privilege to work with all those years, grew up as an orphan on the streets of Jada, not far from Yola, where the university is. And an orphan in the 50s and 60s was a very rare thing in Africa, because those communities take care of each other. So he was in an unusual position. But the American Peace Corps showed up, and four men who went on to be faculty members all over the country at Swarthmore, at Stanford, recognized something in this little boy and adopted him in a sense, in an educational sense. And he's a brilliant man, and he told me when I took over as president, he said, I knew from that experience with the Peace Corps that if I ever had anything in my life, I would do something for America. So the university was really born out of that incredible idea, and a great reminder to me of American soft power, which is so important again at this moment. But he had the vision. He said, Margee, I want this university to be different. So we decided that the role of the university, we would call it a development university. And that resonated so deeply with me that yes, our responsibility was to make sure these young Africans, because while I was there, we were able to bring students on full scholarship, mainly funded by him, from South Africa, from Uganda, from Ghana, from Rwanda. So it really was emerging as sort of the best in sub-Saharan Africa. So yes, our responsibility, of course, was to educate them, but to combine that, as you said, with making sure the city and the region where it was located, which has now been declared the poorest in the world, and I can attest to that, also comes up. So before Boko Haram, before the violence began, we were already, and I think this is the key to success, we had established deep educational partnerships in the community, so that when 300,000 refugees came into town, with that mission, I could turn to students and faculty and say, all right, we've got to feed 300,000 people until help arrives from the outside. And there were not many who said no. The story I remember the most, I was teaching then. I was teaching a class in development, and a young man whose dad owned an oil company, so his future was secure in his mind. And I had started something called Feed and Read for the kids who were orphaned. And it was on campus, but this campus was huge, largest campus in the world, 20 miles. So I said, we're going to walk from, you can do it, walk from the classroom down to the front gate where these young kids are, feed and read. And it was very simple. It was one meal a day and teaching them basic reading. So I walked down, and then in the next class, he walked in and was very angry. And I thought, oh, he's really out of his comfort zone. But his anger was a positive anger, because he said to me, how is it possible that there's an 11-year-old girl in my country who has never seen a book? I said, it's your country. What does that mean to you? And he's gone on now and is doing some pretty amazing things as an entrepreneur in the country. So I learned so much from that experience. Mission matters. Bringing the Chibok women to AUN, and we have 4 here with us here at Dickinson, I think came from a female security guard who came to me and said, you keep talking about this being a development university and we're helping the community. How are you going to help my sister? I said, I don't know your sister. What do you mean? And she said a group of women escaped that night. The world didn't know. No one knew. Michelle Obama and others were talking about them. There were about 50 who escaped that night. And so that's how it came to be that, in the end, about 300 of them, both those who were originally escaped and then the others who were kidnapped for a very long period, came to the university. So I think mission matters. I think saying this is our objective, this is our purpose, and these are the values we will live by. We certainly do that at Dickinson also. I think that's really important, and it helps people understand, all right, this is the purpose of my education. It's to take the education that I'm privileged to get and make a difference in my community.
That's one of the things I think I've been really impressed with at Dickinson, and I know I shouldn't go on because as an alumni I'm biased, but is that in the last 10 years between President Durden and through to you, you've seen a refocusing into not just like internationalism, but to the local community. So the creation of and the operation of the farm, but not just for our own purposes, which, feeding our own students, but then to be able to get, organic foods out into the community. The work you've been doing both pre-COVID and really taken off since the pandemic to try to organize the community and make sure that basic needs are met. These to me are like, when I was in college, like my major criticism of the school was that no one knew what was going on in the streets around us, that we lived in a little bubble, and if you wanted to study homelessness, you were shuttled off to New York or Philadelphia when it was right down the street and we weren't talking about it. So as an activist, I was kind of like, what are we doing?
You should come back. Come back to school.
But that seems to be changing. I'm not sure if that's a trend you're seeing across higher education or if that is more of a unique Dickinson phenomenon that we can replicate.
It's a couple of things. It goes back to origins and mission. Benjamin Rush, who founded Dickinson College, said at the beginning of this country, said that the purpose in establishing Dickinson was to educate citizens for a new democracy, and he wanted it to be a useful education. And we've added, since I got here, it's a useful education for the common good. So we've been able to build on an original mission and vision for an institution. And with some help from a large foundation, we established the Center for Civic Learning and Action, and that's where our work has been centered. And we have been able to do some really important work in our community. But you're right, around the country, it's wonderful to see what's happening. I'm on a board of the Engagement Scholarship Consortium, which is primarily the big land-grant universities. And think about the history of land-grant universities. Why were they established, right? They were established to take the knowledge of agriculture from a university out into the farmers through extension agents, and to make that connection between, here's the knowledge, let's apply it to solve issues of, at the time, hunger and food production. So not surprisingly, the land-grant universities many years ago began to adapt their roles and expand them. They still have extension agents, but they've been leaders in this country in doing work that we now call civic engagement or civic learning and action. Dickinson's the first small liberal arts college, a part of that. But there are campus compacts, so they're emerging. You're seeing different responses to and different models for how colleges should connect to their communities.
I think one of the things that we've seen in Lancaster, and it started with when John Fry was at F&M and continued through President Porterfield, was active involvement in the city's planning and development. The James Street Development District. I know when President Fry was there, he was very involved in trying to help shape that and kind of forge that partnership between the city, and particularly lower income elements of the city, and what F&M and Dickinson, have the reputation you're expensive, all these things that kind of set it apart and sometimes make it out of reach, where you appear to the community as being in your ivory tower. But really doing that outreach to break down the wall and bring the community in and welcome it. One of the things that's really interesting to us at CHI is, we're building a child care center we call the St. John Newman School. And it was designed to be accessible to everybody. And one of the components I thought was fascinating with our board was, it's a discussion where a healthcare organization, I'm going to the board saying we should be involved in early childhood. They're like, you're crazy. And I said, well, here's why. And I said, here's all this research on adverse childhood experiences. Absolutely. We're seeing it in our behavioral health center and our dental program at the time. If we can just stop one of those from happening, if we can lessen the impact of one of those, the savings to the healthcare system, but the benefit to that child would outweigh any cost that we incur. And one of the conditions that the board put into the creation was, it had to be affordable, we had to have a quality program, all those things are brilliant. And they said, but also we have to treat our employees with dignity. And treating them with dignity means paying them a living wage, respecting their time, valuing their time and their skill set. So we've built this system that when we go out and we talk to people and we say, well, this is what we're doing. We're treating our lead teachers like public school teachers. And we're paying our assistant teachers, $18, $20 an hour.
Living wage.
They're like, this is crazy. I said, well, it costs $18, to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in Lancaster. So how can I pay them less and expect them to be able to, lead our most valuable resource from their most vulnerable time? and not be at risk themselves. How can we use the might of universities and colleges to kind of push that agenda of not just wages,
Right.
but basic dignity being returned to the workforce, to all elements of our community?
I think it's a really important question, and what happened at Dickinson, which I think can be a model at other places, is that 3 years ago when I became president, I sort of began a series of listening sessions with community leaders, because of course I have ideas, you have ideas about what should be happening, and I certainly learned in Nigeria as a female, as a white female in a primarily Muslim culture, that I needed to learn and listen for a long time to see how I could have an impact. That if I behaved in my normal way, no one would listen to me. So coming here, I thought, well, do that. Rather than just jumping in and doing 5 things at once, listen to the community and see what they want. So we began these conversations in my living room. And what emerged is exactly what you said from community leaders. And we have been able to pull together business, nonprofits. The faith-based community has been huge here. Policymakers from our state rep to the borough council. We started small though, and the first issue that emerged was livable wages. And I saw it firsthand when I toured one of our homeless shelters here. There was a family living there where the dad worked full-time at one of the big box companies, warehouses. And I thought, no, this isn't right. So we began those discussions. We built trust and support for each other. And we had other projects. The police chief said at one point, I'm really worried about vulnerable children. Can we work on that? So we had all these little subcommittees going on. We had listened to each other. We learned each other's perspectives and goals so that when the pandemic hit, the last meeting in my living room, and there was about 40 people then, it's now 92, we just looked at each other and said, we've got to get through this. Food, getting people to health care. And so that's how this emerged and how it expanded. And as I said, colleges and universities around the US are doing this. I was just on a webinar with academic leaders from Rice, Wayne State, and Montgomery Community College. It's extraordinary what they're doing. Wayne State and Detroit, what they've been doing with urban renewal, with access to health care. The same with Rice right now in the pandemic. And Montgomery Community colleges have always been the foundation of higher education for so many people in this country. And they're providing food to the community. So I think it's a case study. And I've proposed that. We really need to understand the role of higher education over time, but especially at this moment when we don't have national leadership. And the response to this pandemic varies not just from state to state, from community to community.
It's from street to street almost.
Yeah, exactly. And I sense from conversations I've had with other college presidents, many of us are stepping up and helping to solve some of these big issues.
It's interesting you brought up Rice University, because one of the first conversations we started a series when I first really started our Healthy Columbia program, which is all about community transformation. One of the first conversations we brought to Lancaster was the provost of Rice University, Dr. Miranda, who is actually one of the leading child toxicology experts, environmental toxicology experts, because we were talking about lead paint. And the impact it was having in our community. And again, it comes about, many of the issues that we're talking about are systemic and have long roots. That solutions are going to have to be multiple-fold and are going to have some level of patience while also impatient at the same time, which I know is a complete contradiction, but I keep saying this to my staff. Like, things aren't going to happen instantaneously. We're going to keep pushing. We're going to be patient. And then all of a sudden we might have a breakthrough.
Exactly.
And then we also might take 3 steps back. And then we've got to figure out how to get back in there, that we can't lose sight of the goal. And one of those areas has been around lead for us, where we've said, particularly in the borough of Columbia, the housing stock there was 90% of it built before 1978, lead paint rampant throughout. And you see the impacts in terms of academic performance of children, behavior issues and challenges, weird phenomenon happening in terms of behavior patterns in the community.
Exactly.
And it's like, well, how are we going to solve this? How do we keep coming at it? So you start with education and you don't see the response. And my staff person was like, well, we weren't getting the response. And I was like, that was one try.
Right.
This is something that is a hidden issue that people don't believe is serious, somewhat like COVID, but much more,
Right.
in terms of
Right.
longer impacts to the community. That we have to keep slowly educating and finding new strategies
Right.
and find ways to make these things living wage, safe environments, not individual organization issues,
Exactly.
but community priorities.
Right.
That what I have said is that the problem we're having with some of the issues, and legislation is the answer sometimes. I get that. I'm not a poli-sci major,
Right.
but I understand the legislative push. Some of it is just a priorities issue.
Right.
Where we've tolerated it or not made it important, and so then it goes that way. So with lead in particular, I always said, we can get grants from the federal government and they're tied, but then there's always money that has to come out of the homeowner's pocket.
Right.
And if it's an invisible problem,
Right,
that
exactly.
money's never going to come out of the homeowner's pocket.
Right.
So you can't spend the federal grant, you can't get them to buy into the concept. It will take things like the community rising up and saying, can't have lead in our community anymore.
Right.
Or we're going to have living wage in our community.
Right.
And then people stepping up to be able to respond. And it will take creative structures that we haven't envisioned yet.
No, I think that's right. But I think so much of the change in this country is I've begun focusing more on what communities can do and have done, bubbles up. But there always has to be policy, right? When we look at whether we're talking about social inequities, racial inequities, we also need to understand the invisible problems of policy and what policy that's been misguided has done in the past. So I think it's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
But we can never underestimate what communities can do when they do realize and then begin demanding changes.
And when we hear them, I mean, I can remember early on in my career at CHI, Catholic Health Initiatives, at a nationwide meeting, and an individual was talking about a clinic they had built for the Latino community. I was like, oh, that's great. Yeah, but no one came. And I was like, okay, well, what happened? And it turns out they had built the clinic in the wrong part of town.
Right.
And I was like, well, how did you not
Who
hear
did you listen
it?
to?
Yeah, did you not hear it?
Right.
You just saw on paper, like there's a gap
Right.
for the Latino community, we're going to build a clinic, but you didn't listen
That's right.
to where we have to do that. And you see the unintended consequences of not doing that. It's one of the things I think
Absolutely.
Dr. Miranda really pointed out to me when she visited with us from Rice, was around the results of building the interstate highway system and how we decimated African American and Latino
right.
communities by where we chose to place highways.
Exactly. With the pollution that is
never thought of the
emerged.
consequence and
That's
how you
right.
cut them off. I mean, one of the things that you see in Columbia, this borough that we do a lot of work in, is you built the Route 30 bypass and then the town died
Right.
because no one had to come through town, and there was no effort to really talk about, well, how do you revitalize this? Like, what do they have now that they don't have this traffic
Exactly.
that was feeding their economy?
Oh, that's
and
right.
instead we just have left them kind of out there struggling on their own.
Right.
Again, a good policy in theory. It's everybody likes to
Right.
hire. Got me here in an hour from Lancaster, right?
Right.
But
the whole
instead,
community was involved in the decision.
yeah,
Right.
it was someone dictating to them how you do that. So we're completely off my questions, which is fine.
It's fine.
That's what I find completely fascinating about these conversations is you start to go down a path, and there's so much there to talk about that changes the structure. And
Of course.
one of the things that I've seen, from the time I was here at Dickinson till now, is the effort to increase access to the type of education we offer here,
Absolutely.
which is spectacular. So I'll give you good credit there. To minority students. We've
Absolutely.
always had a very small percentage of the overall student population being
Right.
from minority backgrounds, regardless of just the overall. So how and what steps can we take to address that racial inequity within higher education and provide that opportunity? What would you suggest as first steps?
I think that's a start. Things that Dickinson has done. Our percentage of our underserved students has probably tripled, if not quadrupled, since you were here. So again, it's a choice of values and priorities, and we have been using much of the proceeds from our endowment earnings to fund financial aid, to fund education. So, but we need to do that all over the country, and it goes back to some of the issues you talked about. It starts very young. So I think we're realizing through this pandemic where kids from lower incomes and underserved communities, they don't have access to technology. So we're seeing that and realizing we must bring those communities up. So I think, that one can't just be a community-wide response.
Yeah.
We've got to have a national effort to make sure that we really live as an inclusive society. And it starts with education, access to health care. You know better than anybody the disparities now with COVID. If you look at who's dying from it, predominantly it's Black and brown people. I saw a study yesterday that said with equal access to health care, there's no disparity. So, perhaps during this really difficult time, we are all reflecting on what kind of society we currently live in and what do we want for the future. And getting access to the highest quality education changes the world. It did for the Chibok women. One of those that we brought that day as I was leaving AUN, I asked her, what did the education mean to her? And she said, profound words. She didn't realize that I keep this in my heart, in my head all the time. Education gives me the wings to fly, the power to speak. I can't remember the third part, but it's clear, it was clear to her how it was transforming not just her life, but her communities. So that's got to be the starting point.
How do we start the conversations? I think a lot of local school districts are struggling with this now. I was just actually talking to a colleague of mine yesterday about the really kind of nasty debate that's taking place in her school district about altering curriculums so that really all children can see themselves reflected in history and in sociology work that's being, with education being very fragmented with local control, which there are pluses and minuses to that. How do we get to the point where, an African-American child in a predominantly Caucasian community still can see themselves and then know that a future can be different than maybe what they're seeing right now, and that opportunity can be created for them?
I mean, it's certainly just kind of beyond my area of expertise, and you're absolutely right. Local communities in most places in the U.S. determine the curriculum, and that's a big challenge. I would think it would begin with teacher training and looking really carefully at how we do that. And something we talked about at the beginning, getting teachers out to see other parts of the country. I talked to a superintendent here right before the pandemic emerged, and we were going to be doing a really interesting civic engagement and learning class with his school district as well as the Carlisle. And he had just come back from the lynching museum in the South. And he said that fundamentally changed the way I see education. So things like that, where we completely get out of our comfort zone. And, it's long overdue that we do that in America. And again, that's what we've learned through the recent protests, is that we have a very long way to go with racial and social equality in this country. And, we're all in our own little bubble, and so travel and getting out and, experiencing new cultures and learning more about your country when we can again by traveling to those places, changing teacher education so that it is partly more experiential, I think is going to be important.
What steps can we take to better recruit a diverse workforce? So at Dickinson, you have obviously specialties, so we have the same challenge where we have specialties we're looking for within our behavioral health practice and others. And one of the priorities for us has always been, and I don't think we're doing well in it, is diversifying our workforce so that, if an African-American kid is coming to us for behavioral health, and it's important to them that they see a therapist that looks like them and they have that connection if they want it. So what types of things?
I think you have to be really deliberate. And again, not just say, I want a diverse student body or I want a diverse workforce. I think anytime you're hiring, you have to make sure you've got a diverse candidate there in every position that you're hiring. So I think we need to put in place ways that don't just confirm that we want to do it, right? You have to have measurable objectives. And then, people at the top, like you, have to say, in this interview, where are your diverse candidates? And so you advertise differently, you use different networks. We get used to doing things the same way, whether you're in healthcare or in education, and I think we just, especially right now, need to be a lot more deliberate and focused.
So one of the goals of this project, and what I thought was interesting, is when I joined Catholic Health Initiatives, part of our core, which has always been there since the sisters founded our health systems, was the creation of healthy communities. So I said to my boss, I said, well, what does that mean? Like, what do you want me creating? Like, I'm happy to do it. Like, what does it What does it mean? And he said, well, I don't know. It's a local thing. And I get that to some extent. But what would you say, and again, it's not something we prepared for, what are kind of the core tenets that you would say? So if we were going to create a healthy community, not just on a college campus, but on a campus and
Right.
what are the things that need to be in place? And they might look slightly different because of local flavor and cultural, but what are the core components of that ingredient to create this healthy community?
It's a really good question, and it takes me back to my time in Nigeria. This very, very poor community that didn't even have indoor plumbing. So we had to ask that question: what would it mean to take care of people, right? So I think it starts with healthy food. You have to have enough food to eat. And one story I carry in my heart from that experience was a young man who worked for me, who I became very close to him and his family. And his little boy was not growing. And I kept thinking, oh, it's, I mean, I'm small, I'm short, but over a few years, I thought, it's hormonal, it's thyroid, right? You think of all the Western challenges. And so we flew him to Abuja, the capital, because there was really no health care in our large community except for what was at the university, and they couldn't figure it out. Well, I was devastated to find out that he was stunted, right? We don't think stunting exists anymore. It exists in a lot of places around the world. And if a child is stunted, you know better than most, it means they'll never live up to their full potential. So we began looking around, and I realized I'm not just in a community of short people because of a genetic issue. It's because they don't have access to healthy food in an area that's an agricultural area. So it gets back to issues of wages. It gets back to issues of basic sanitation, at least where I was, with the challenges we were facing, to healthcare, and then more advanced education. So, but again, I think it will require us, in the United States, to begin focusing a little bit less on how do I achieve as an individual, and how does my community, have what it needs to support everyone. It's a real change in worldview. And in more communal societies, whether it's Asian or Latin American or African, that sometimes is an easier discussion. But again, maybe going through this pandemic and seeing what happens when you don't have equitable policies and access in place, whether it's healthcare, whether it's testing, whether it's access to what young kids need now in terms of technology for education. I hope there's enough people thinking about that. But it's kind of the Maslow's very basic needs, right? You have to have food, you won't survive. You have to have water, clean water, and we laugh, but many communities in the US, as you know, with the lead issue, and certainly around the world, and with climate change, fresh, clean water is going to be a much bigger challenge. So I think we need to go back and focus on some of those pretty basic issues.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it, and I applaud the work that you've done here at Dickinson. It's very exciting to see.
Thank you for coming home, and you're always welcome. Thank you.